Good evening, dear dreamer. Chris here tonight. We're going to continue our journey throughout the history of the United States of America and its presidents. This is the second part, and we're starting with the president number 20, James A. Garfield, as our community of dreamy historians is slowly growing. Let me just say a massive thank you to you all who subscribed and showed us love here. I can't thank you enough. I truly appreciate your support, and I'm over the moon that you're enjoying our videos. Love you to bits, and we'll be forever grateful now. Without further ado, let's dive in. James A. Garfield, the scholar in the shadows on a snowy November 19th, 1831, in a humble log cabin in Orange Township, Ohio, a boy named James Abram Garfield entered the world under the weight of hardship. He would grow to become the 20th President of the United States, a brilliant mind whose light flickered far too briefly. His father died when James was just 2, raised by his mother Eliza and an older brother. The Garfield family lived in deep poverty, surviving of firewood and grit. Young James worked on a canal boat and dreamed of the sea until illness cut that short. But his mind was insatiable. He devoured books, taught himself Greek and Latin, and clawed his way from manual labor to academic excellence. He attended Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, later Higham College, and graduated from Williams College in Massachusetts. He returned to Higham as a professor, and then its president before stepping into public life. Garfield never chased power, but power found him. He entered the Ohio Senate in 1859 and the U.S. House of Representatives in 1863, serving throughout the Civil War and Reconstruction. He remained in Congress for 17 years, becoming one of its most respected intellectuals, a gifted orator and policy mind. Garfield stood firm on key issues he supported: abolition, civil rights, fiscal conservatism, and education reform. He believed in merit fairness and the Union. He served briefly as a major general in the Union Army, fighting in the Battle of Middle Creek and earning praise for his leadership, though politics pulled him back. Garfield's mind moved like lightning. He could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other. Simultaneously, in 1880, Garfield attended the Republican National Convention to nominate another candidate, but after 36 ballots and deep party division, the delegates turned to a compromise. To his astonishment, James A. Garfield was nominated for president. He ran a low-key campaign from his home in Mentor, Ohio, giving speeches to crowds on his lawn, a style dubbed the Front Porch Campaign. He won the election by a narrow margin. At 49, Garfield became the youngest president elected at that time, entering the White House with hopes of reform and unity. Garfield's presidency began with ambition. He challenged the spoil system, appointing officials based on merit rather than loyalty. He worked to modernize the Navy and improve the civil service. He supported black suffrage and fought against Southern efforts to suppress the vote. But he faced resistance from powerful party figures, especially Roscoe Conkling, the leader of the stalwart faction. Garfield's insistence on appointing reformers over political loyalists deepened tensions. He had just begun to find his footing when tragedy struck on July 2nd, 1881. Just 4 months into his presidency, Garfield walked through the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. A disgruntled office seeker named Charles J. Gow, furious at being denied a political appointment, shot him twice. One bullet grazed Garfield's arm, the other lodged deep in his back. He did not die. Immediately, doctors lacking proper hygiene or modern knowledge probed the wound with unwashed fingers and instruments. Infection-setting Garfield lingered for 80 agonizing days, drifting between hope and despair As the nation watched and prayed, on September 19th, 1881, James Garfield died of sepsis in a New Jersey seaside cottage. He was 49. The nation mourned deeply. Bells tolled, crowds wept openly. For many, he represented a different kind of leadership, thought-principled and full of unrealized promise. His death helped galvanize support for civil service reform, which passed under his successor, Chester A. Arthur, in the form of the Pendleton Act of 1883. Garfield's presidency was brief, but his intellect and ideals left a lasting impression. He believed in the power of education, the dignity of work, and the moral obligations of leadership. He rose from poverty to the presidency without ever losing his humility or his thirst for knowledge. Though his time in office was short, his story endures, a reminder that wisdom and compassion, though sometimes silenced early, can echo for generations. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, picture a man seated at his desk by lantern light, surrounded by books quietly shaping ideas that could guide a nation. He is not seeking applause, he is thinking, writing, serving, because James Garfield believed that leadership begins in the mind and blossoms in the heart. And though fate gave him little time, he used every moment to stand for what mattered. Chester A. Arthur, the gentleman president, on October 5th, 1829, a baby boy named Chester. Alan Arthur was born in either Fairfield, Vermont, or possibly Canada, a mystery that sparked whispers for years. His father, William Arthur, was a fiery Irish preacher, and his mother, Malvina, a hard-working woman of frontier grit. Young Chester grew up in upstate New York, where he developed an appreciation for fashion, culture, and education. He attended Union College in Sked, excelling in the classics and joining debating societies that sharpened his rhetorical gifts. Arthur became a school teacher, then a lawyer, practicing in New York City, where he developed a keen eye for legal nuance and a taste for tailored suits. Polished and poised, he was soon drawn to politics, specifically the Republican Party, which was gaining power in the years before the Civil War. In 1854, Arthur took on one of the earliest civil rights cases of the era, representing Elizabeth Jennings, a black woman forcibly removed from a streetcar. Arthur won the case, helping to integrate New York's transit system, a sign of the conscience he kept even in a party machine. He rose through the ranks as a skilled administrator and was appointed Quartermaster General of the New York Militia during the Civil War, where he proved himself masterful at logistics organization and supply. He lived in the glittering world of Gilded Age New York, mingling with high society, while also navigating the gritty back rooms of Republican politics. Arthur became deeply embedded in the stalwart faction of the Republican Party, loyal to Senator Roscoe Conkling, and the powerful patronage system that rewarded political allies with government jobs. In 1871, President U.L.S. Grant appointed him collector of the Port of New York, one of the most lucrative and influential federal positions in the nation. Arthur thrived overseeing customs and quietly amassing a small fortune. But in 1878, President Rutherford B. Hayes, pushing civil service reform, fired Arthur as part of his campaign against corruption. Arthur returned to private life wounded but not defeated in 1880, when James A. Garfield secured the Republican nomination. Party leaders sought to appease the powerful, stalwart faction. Arthur, though largely unknown outside New York, was chosen as vice president. He never expected to hold real power, but just months into Garfield's term, an assassin's bullet changed everything. After Garfield's long, agonizing death, Arthur, long considered a party loyalist with little vision, became President of the United States on September 19, 1881. To everyone's surprise, the party machine man became a president of reform and dignity. Arthur supported the Pendleton Civil Service Act, establishing merit-based government jobs and reducing the influence of patronage, modernized the U.S. Navy, investing in steel ships and professionalizing naval operations, rejected corruption, and distanced himself from old political allies, even breaking with conquering. He redecorated the White House with elegance, held formal dinners, and took nightly strolls to clear his mind. Known for his impeccable fashion sense, he became named the Elegant Arthur. Arthur carried a quiet sorrow. His beloved wife, Ellen Hernan. Arthur had died of pneumonia in 1880, just before he assumed the vice presidency. He mourned her deeply and kept a room in the White House in her honor. Though known for social charm and polished manners, Arthur was a solitary soul who found refuge in books, art, and walks under moonlight. He served with restraint, balancing Republican factions, avoiding extremes, and guiding the nation through calm and dignified stewardship. Arthur never sought a second term, suffering from Bright's disease. A serious kidney condition, he chose not to run. In 1884, he returned to New York City and resumed private life, declining rapidly in health on November 18, 1886. At the age of 57, Chester, as Arthur passed away largely forgotten by a public that had never fully understood the depth of his quiet transformation. Arthur's legacy is subtle yet profound. He began as a symbol of party politics, but rose when the nation needed him to become a leader of principle. He championed reform, strengthened the civil service, and restored public faith in the presidency during a cynical time, though few remember him. With monuments, he is remembered with growing respect. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, picture a well-dressed man walking the silent corridors of the White House, burdened by grief, illuminated by duty, because Chester, Arthur, believed that a man could grow into greatness not by changing the world, but by changing himself. Grover Cleveland, the unlikely president, on March 18, 1837, in Caldwell, New Jersey, a baby named Stephen Grover Cleveland entered the world as the fifth of 9 children. His father, a Presbyterian minister, instilled in him values of honesty, discipline, and duty. The Cleveland family moved often, finally settling in upstate New York. Grover left school early to support the family after his father's death, working as a teacher store clerk and eventually a law clerk. With determination and long nights of study, he became a lawyer in Buffalo. He dropped his first name Stephen and became simply Grover Cleveland Rose, steadily in Buffalo as a respected attorney, known for integrity, hard work, and a stubborn streak of independence. He avoided the political games of his day, but earned admiration for his fair-minded approach. He served as sheriff of Erie County, where he personally hanged 2 criminals, a grim but honest execution of duty mayor of Buffalo, earning the nickname the Veto Mayor, for blocking waste spending governor of New York, where he fought corruption and clashed with political machines like Tammany Hall. Cleveland's motto was simple: a public office is a public trust. In 1884, the Democratic Party nominated Cleveland for president. His Republican opponent, James G. Blaine, was dogged by scandals, while Cleveland's reputation for honesty won over reform-minded voters, many of whom crossed party lines to support him. The campaign was brutal, with personal attacks on Cleveland's character, including a scandal involving an illegitimate child. Cleveland admitted the truth and took responsibility. He won the election and became the 22nd President of the United States, the first Democrat elected since the Civil War. Cleveland governed with a strict sense of duty. He vetoed hundreds of bills, especially pension frauds and special interest giveaways. He opposed unnecessary government spending, including rejecting a bill to provide seeds to drought-stricken farmers, controversially arguing it wasn't the government's role. He fought for civil service reform, battling patronage, and promoting merit-based appointments. Though not a charismatic speaker, Cleveland was seen as a bulwark of integrity in a gilded age of political excess. In 1886, at age 49, he married Frances Phelan, 27 years his junior, the youngest First Lady in U.S. history. Their White House wedding charmed the nation. In 1888, Cleveland lost re-election to Benjamin Harrison despite winning the popular vote. He quietly returned to private life in New York, but remained a powerful Democratic voice in 2008. 1892, he ran again and won, becoming the only president in U.S. history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He returned to the White House as the 24th president, older, wiser, and facing a nation in economic turmoil. Cleveland's second term was marked by crisis. The Panic of 1893 triggered a deep economic depression. He supported the gold standard alienating pro-silver Democrats. He faced labor unrest, including the Pullman strike, which he quelled with federal troops, sparking controversy despite political cost. Cleveland refused to bend to popular pressure, insisting on sound fiscal policy and the integrity of the presidency. He also underwent a secret surgery aboard a yacht to remove a cancerous tumor from his mouth kept hidden from the public to avoid panic. After leaving office in 1897, Cleveland retired to Princeton, New Jersey, where he remained active in education, speaking engagements, and writing. He served on the board of trustees at Princeton University and continued to champion nonpartisan government honesty and civic virtue. He died on June 24, 1908, at age 71, remembered as a man who never flinched from hard decisions, even when they cost him politically. Grover Cleveland's legacy is one of principle over piety. He believed that government must be limited, accountable, and honest. He vetoed more bills than any president before him, not to obstruct but to preserve the public trust. Though his presidencies were marked by economic and political turbulence, he stood firm. His courage to do what was right rather than what was easy earned him the admiration of future generations, because Grover Cleveland believed that character is the true test of leadership, and in storms the oak does not bend. Benjamin Harrison, the quiet patriot, on a wintry day, August 20th, 1833, in North Bend, Ohio, a baby boy named Benjamin Harrison was born into a family already woven into the fabric of American history. He was the grandson of William Henry Harrison IX, President, and the great-grandson of Benjamin Harrison Aigner of the Declaration of Independence. Despite the legacy, Benjamin grew up with quiet humility. His father, John Scott Harrison, was a respected congressman, but their lifestyle was modest. Young Benjamin was raised in the rolling fields of Ohio with strong values, faith learning, and patriotism. He studied at the Miami University in Ohio, where he developed a love of oratory and deepened his faith. After graduation, he studied law and moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, to begin his practice and start a new chapter. When the Civil War broke out, Harrison joined the Union Army, rising to the rank of Brigadier General. He never sought glory, but he earned it quietly, respected by his men for being calm, composed, and courageous under fire. After the war, he returned to Indianapolis, where he resumed his law career and entered politics. He served as U.S. Senator from Indiana, known for his brilliant legal mind and firm belief in civil rights, particularly for African Americans in the South. He wasn't flashy, but he was solid, dependable, and deeply principled, a man who didn't command attention, but quietly earned admiration. In 1888, the Republican Party nominated Harrison to challenge the incumbent President Grover Cleveland. Though Cleveland won the popular vote, Harrison carried the Electoral College and was elected the 23rd President of the United States. His campaign had been funded in part by wealthy industrialists. Support would influence public perception of his presidency, but Harrison believed firmly in protecting American industry, strengthening the nation, and honoring the Union. He began his term with quiet confidence and a clear sense of duty. President Harrison's administration was marked by significant achievements. He signed the McKinley Tariff, which raised duties on imported goods to protect American manufacturing, popular in the North but controversial in the South and West. He supported the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first major law to limit monopolies and curb corporate abuse. He advocated for civil rights, including federal education funding and voting protections for African Americans. Though such bills were ultimately blocked by the Senate under his leadership, 6 states were admitted to the Union: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. He modernized the U.S. Navy, expanding and strengthening America's maritime power. He believed in an active federal government that could shape and guide the nation. Harrison was not a man of grand speeches or theatrical gestures. He was more comfortable in his study, reading scripture or sharing stories with his beloved wife Caroline and their children. Caroline was an accomplished First Lady. She supported the arts, worked on historic preservation of the White House, and helped establish the Daughters of the American Revolution. Sadly, Caroline fell gravely ill during Harrison's presidency. She died in 1892, just weeks before the election. The loss devastated Harrison in the 1892 election. Grover Cleveland returned and defeated Harrison, reclaiming the presidency. Harrison's support for high tariffs and business interests had alienated some voters during a time of rising populist sentiment after leaving office. Harrison returned to Indianapolis, where he resumed law and gave cures across the country. He remarried in 1896 to Mary Dimmick, his late wife's niece and former aide, a decision that stirred some controversy. Harrison remained engaged in public affairs, arguing before the Supreme Court, writing on constitutional issues and supporting international peace efforts. He died on March 13, 1901, at the age of 67, though not a fiery figure of history. Harrison was remembered by those who knew him as a man of character, discipline, and integrity. Benjamin Harrison's presidency was one of quiet but consequential action. He strengthened the economy, expanded the Union, and laid groundwork for future reforms he believed in. Beauty in the rule of law, and in protecting the dignity of every citizen. His voice was not loud, but it was measured, thoughtful, and rooted in conviction. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, picture a man standing at his desk writing by lamplight, his spectacles balanced on the bridge of his nose. He is not seeking applause, he is seeking truth, because Benjamin Harrison believed the true leadership is quiet, humble, and grounded in purpose. a steady hand guiding the ship of state through uncertain seas. William McKinley on January 29th, 1843, in the modest town of Niles, Ohio, a baby boy named William McKinley Jr. was born into a large, industrious family. He was the seventh of 9 children raised by William Sr. and Nancy Allison McKinley, both of whom valued education, thrift, and faith. Young William was polite, thoughtful, and bright. He attended Calvin Coolidge brief, but had to withdraw due to illness and family finances. Still, he continued studying and eventually became a school teacher, then enlisted when war came knocking. When the Civil War erupted, McKinley was just 18 when he joined the 23rd Ohio Infantry, where he served under future President Rutherford B. Hayes. He rose from private to brevet major, earning respect for his bravery and calm. Under fire at the Battle of Antietam, he delivered food and coffee to soldiers under heavy fire, an act of selfless courage that became legend after the war. He studied law, was admitted to the bar in Canton, Ohio, and soon entered public life. McKinley served in the U.S. House of Representatives for 14 years. He became known as an expert on tariff policy, championing protectionism to support American industries. His most famous legislative achievement was the McKinley Tariff of 1890, which raised import duties. Though intended to boost U.S. manufacturing, it also raised consumer prices and sparked political backlash. Still, his quiet charisma and methodical thinking made him a respected Republican leader. In 1891, he was elected governor of Ohio, serving 2 terms with a focus on industrial growth, fair labor laws, and moderate reforms. In 1896, as economic hardship gripped the country, the Republican Party nominated McKinley for president. His opponent, William Jennings, Bryan crisscrossed the nation with fiery populist speeches. McKinley Street, home in Canton, delivering speeches from his front porch to thousands of visiting delegations, an approach that conveyed calm and confidence. He campaigned on the promise of sound money-backing currency with gold and economic revival. His campaign was masterfully managed by Mark Hanna, a political strategist who raised vast funds and ensured McKinley's message reached every corner of the country. He won in a landslide. McKinley's first term was defined by prosperity and power. He signed the Gold Standard Act stabilizing the economy. He passed high tariffs to protect U.S. industry. He presided over the Spanish-American War, 1898, sparked by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The war lasted just a few months, but its consequences were immense. The U.S. gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines and Cuba became independent. McKinley's leadership during the war, careful, deliberate, and focused on unity, earned widespread praise. The victory signaled America's emergence as a global power. In 1900, McKinley ran for re-election with a bold, energetic running mate, Theodore Roosevelt. His second campaign echoed the themes of prosperity, expansion, and stability. He won easily, but just months into his second term, tragedy struck on September 6, 1901, while shaking hands at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. McKinley was shot twice by Leon Cholos, an anarchist who opposed government and authority doctors operated, but complications set in on September 14. McKinley died. His last words were, "It is God's way. His will, not ours, be done." The nation was stunned. Cities held candlelight vigils. Flags were lowered. Crowds wept openly. McKinley, with his warm smile, had become a symbol of quiet stability and progress. He was buried in Canton, Ohio, where a magnificent memorial still stands. McKinley's presidency marked the end of an old era and the start of the modern American century. He led the country into global prominence, presided over economic recovery, and set the stage for American imperial influence, though sometimes overshadowed by his successor, Roosevelt. McKinley is remembered for his firm, steady leadership kindness and devotion to duty. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, picture a man in a crisp black suit standing on a quiet front porch, hands clasped, speaking gently to a hopeful crowd below. He is calm, not loud, because William McKinley believed that strength lies in composure, that unity is forged in peace, and that leadership can wear a smile. Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, on October 27, 1858, in a handsome brownstone in New York City, a sickly baby boy was born into privilege but not into ease. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., or Teddy, as he would come to be affectionately known, gasped his first breaths through the tight grip of severe asthma. His wealthy father, Theodore Sr., believed in building strength through effort, and took young Teddy on brisk walks, carriage rides, and even had him breathe steam to ease his attacks. His mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, a Southern belle, filled the house with charm, tradition, and warmth rather than surrender to frailty. Teddy declared war on it. He committed himself to what he called the strenuous life, a philosophy of pushing the body and mind to their limits. He built up his lungs and spirit in the gym and on hunting trips, transforming weakness into warriorhood. Teddy's mind was as fierce as his determination. He was a vicious reader, consuming books on history, science, politics, and nature. He graduated from Harvard University in 1880, already known for his brilliance, eccentricity, and boundless energy. That same year, he married Alice Hathaway Lee, his first great love. He entered politics shortly after becoming a member of the New York State Assembly at just 23, but tragedy struck in 1884. Within hours, both his mother and his wife died on the same day. In his diary, he drew a large X across the page and wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." Crushed, he left politics and escaped to the Badlands of North Dakota, where he lived as a cowboy rancher and frontier philosopher there. Among wild horses and bitter winds, he healed, refreshed by the Roosevelt. Returned to New York and to public service, he remarried, this time to Edith Kermit Carow, a childhood friend, and together they raised 6 children in a home filled with books, pets, and wild laughter. He served as US Civil Service Commissioner, fighting corruption, president of the New York City Police Board, reforming a scandal-plagued Force Assistant Secretary of the Navy, modernizing America's fleet. When war with Spain erupted in 1898, Roosevelt resigned his post, formed the Rough Riders, and charged up San Juan Hill in Cuba, becoming a national hero. In 1899, Roosevelt became governor of New York, pushing progressive reforms that frustrated party bosses to get rid of him. They nominated him as vice president under William McKinley in 1900, thinking he'd disappear into political obscurity. They miscalculated when McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States, the youngest ever at just 42 years old. Roosevelt brought a new energy to the presidency. He fought for the square deal, promising fairness to labor business and consumers alike. He busted monopolies using the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up powerful corporate trusts. He championed railroad regulation, pure food and drug laws, and worker protections. But his heart was often in the wild. He protected over 230 million acres of public land, established 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 150 national forests, summoned John Muir, the famed naturalist, to camp in Yosemite and dream up conservation. Together, Roosevelt was the first president to understand the presidency as a bully pulpit, a place from which to rally the people to noble causes. Roosevelt believed in speaking softly, but carrying a big stick. He expanded American influence abroad, negotiated peace in the Russo-Japanese War. Earning the Nobel Peace Prize, oversaw the beginning of the Panama Canal, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, declared the Roosevelt Kuraly to the Monroe Doctrine, asserting us power in the Western Hemisphere. He combined diplomacy with decisiveness and elevating America to global prominence, while always looking for ways to balance power with principle. True to his word, Roosevelt did not seek a third term in 1908, instead supporting William Howard, TFT, his friend and successor. But TFT's presidency disappointed him, feeling betrayed by what he saw as a retreat from reform. Roosevelt returned in 1912, running as a third-party progressive, the Bull Moose Party. He was shot in the chest during a campaign speech, but insisted on finishing his address before seeking medical help. "It takes more than that to kill Bull Moose," he growled. Though he lost the election to Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt had reshaped American politics and reinvigorated reform movements. Never one to sit still, Roosevelt embarked on an Amazon expedition. In 1913, the journey nearly killed him. He caught a tropical infection, lost 60 billion, and never fully recovered. In his later years, he continued to write, speak, and advocate for American preparedness. During World War I, his health faded, but his spirit remained AED fierce. On January 6, 1919, he died in his sleep. Vice President Thomas Marshall said death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight. Theodore Roosevelt remains one of the most dynamic, complex, and beloved figures in American history. He redefined the presidency as an active force for justice, reform, and moral leadership. He fought for the common man, the natural world, and the soul of America. Though imperfect at times, aggressive, imperialistic, and brash, he never stopped fighting for what he believed was right. He showed that power could be wielded with purpose as you close your eyes and drift into dreams. Picture a man bounding across the White House lawn, children chasing behind books under one arm, and a parrot squawking on his shoulder. He pauses to wrestle with a visiting diplomat, then bounds off again, laughing, shouting, dreaming, because Theodore Roosevelt believed that life must be lived boldly, that justice must be pursued fiercely, and that even a mustache can change the world. William Howard, TFT, the Gentle Giant, on September 15, 1857, in Cincinnati, Ohio, a healthy baby boy named William Howard, TFT, was born into a world of opportunity. His family was well established in politics and law. His father, Alonzo Taft, served as Attorney General and Secretary of War under President Ulysses S. Grant. Young William was smart, affable, and built like a young oak tree. He excelled in school, developed a love for wrestling where he was nearly unbeatable, and graduated second in his class from Yale University. He went on to study law, following his father's footsteps with quiet confidence and an enormous appetite for both justice and pies. TFT was never a man with presidential dreams. His true love was the judiciary, the quiet power of the law, the intellectual thrill of fair argument. He rose through the legal world, with grace served as a judge in Ohio, became Solicitor General of the United States. Arguing cases before the Supreme Court appointed a federal circuit judge gaining a reputation for careful reasoning and fairness. In 1900, President William McKinley tapped him to lead the Philippine Commission, later serving as the first civilian governor-general of the Philippines, where he gained admiration for his even-handed administration and reformist ideals. President Theodore Roosevelt, a close friend and admirer, brought Taft back to Washington as Secretary of War, grooming him as his political heir. Roosevelt saw in TFT a man of integrity, intellect and gentleness, a steady hand to carry forward progressive reforms in 1908. With Roosevelt's full backing, TFT was elected the 27th President of the United States, but Tar, ever the jurist, never quite took to politics. Taft's presidency was defined by his loyalty to the law and the Constitution. He prosecuted more antitrust cases than Roosevelt, including Against Us, Steel and Standard Oil, strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission, regulating railroads, and advocated for tariff reform. Though his efforts were politically costly, supported the 16th Amendment, which authorized a federal income tax, promoted judicial reform, and civil service protection. But his quiet style clashed with Roosevelt's flair, and his cautious approach frustrated progressives who craved bold action. Their friendship soured. Roosevelt grew disillusioned with what he saw as Taft's retreat from progressive ideals. In 1912, Roosevelt ran against him as a third-party candidate, forming the Bull Moose Party. The Republican vote split, and Woodrow Wilson won the election. TF took the loss with dignity, returning to Yale to teach law and reflect on the bruises of politics, though his president was mixed in success and shadowed by Roosevelt's larger-than-life presence. TFT's dream was yet to come true. In 1921, President Warren G. Harding appointed Taft as Chief Justice of the United States, a role he had always longed for. As Chief Justice, Taft modernized. The federal judiciary advocated for the construction of the Supreme Court building, giving the court its own physical home, presided over landmark cases. With grace and dignity, he became the only person in U.S. history to lead both the executive and judicial branches of government. Taft served as Chief Justice until just weeks before his death. He had found his true calling, and it gave him great joy. He passed away on March 8, 1930, and was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, the first president to be laid to rest there despite popular myths such as the often exaggerated tale of getting stuck in a White House bathtub. T's legacy is not one of laughter, but of legal excellence, measured reform, and profound service. He was a man of substance in a time of spectacle, a thinker in a world of shouters. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, picture a large man seated at a wide desk, spectacles on the tip of his nose, a soft smile on his face as he reads the Constitution by lamplight, because William Howard Taft believed that true greatness doesn't shout, it reasons, it listens, and it lasts. Woodrow Wilson, the Professor President, on December 28, 1856, in Ston, Virginia. A baby named Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born into a deeply religious Presbyterian household. The Civil War would soon erupt, and young Tommy, as he was known, then grew up amid sermons, Confederate cannon fire, and Reconstruction. He was a slow learner, early on likely dyslexic, but his determination and love for words burned bright. Books became his companions, and he found solace in language ideas and the rhythms of rhetoric. Wilson earned degrees from Princeton University, the University of Virginia Law School, and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, making him the only U.S. president with a PhD. He became a professor of political science. then the president of Princeton, where he pushed educational reform and clashed with elite alumni. Though reserved in manner, his mind pulsed with purpose. Wilson's academic fame caught the eye of New Jersey Democrats, who saw in him a clean reform figure to counter-party corruption. In 1910, he was elected governor of New Jersey, where he surprised everyone by actually cleaning up the party machine. Within 2 years, he was the Democratic nominee for president, running on the promise of a new freedom. Wilson won the election of 1912, aided by the Republican vote being split between William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson entered the White House in 1913 as the 28th President of the United States, bringing his scholarly vision to life on a national stage. Wilson's first term was a whirlwind of progressive reform. He signed the Federal Reserve Act, creating the central banking system still in use today. He established the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, to fight monopoly. He passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, strengthening antitrust laws. He supported the 16th Amendment federal income tax and the 17th Amendment direct election of senators. He signed the Underwood Tariff Act, reducing tariffs and creating a graduated income tax. Though progressive economically, Wilson's views on race were deeply flawed. His administration segregated federal offices, a shameful step backward. When World War I erupted in 1914, Wilson pledged neutrality, urging Americans to remain impartial in thought as well as in action. But as German U-boat sank ships and the Zimmermann telegram proposed a German-Mexican alliance, Wilson was forced to act in 1917. He asked Congress for a declaration of war to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson mobilized the nation, oversaw a massive draft and military buildup, managed wartime production and propaganda, supported civil liberties restrictions, including the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which remained controversial. The war ended in 1918, with Wilson hailed as a world leader and peace architect. Wilson traveled to Paris in 1999 for the Versailles Peace Conference, becoming the first sitting U.S. president to visit Europe. There he proposed his visionary 14 points calling for open diplomacy, free trade, national self-determination. Most importantly, the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But the Treaty of Versailles punished Germany harshly. Wilson, desperate to preserve the League, accepted the compromise back home. Opposition in the U.S. Senate, led by Henry Cat Lodge, doomed the treaty. The U.S. never joined. The League a heartbreaking defeat for Wilson in 1919 while campaigning for the League. Wilson suffered a massive stroke. He was left partially paralyzed and blind in one eye. For months, the White House concealed the severity of his condition. His wife, Edith Wilson, essentially ran the executive branch, one of the most unusual chapters in presidential history. Wilson, though weakened, clung to his ideals. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1920, but was too ill to enjoy the honor. He finished his term in 1921 and retired to a quiet home in Washington, D.C., where he died on February 3, 1924. Wilson's legacy is complex. He reshaped the presidency, expanding federal power and guiding the nation through World War. He laid the foundation for international cooperation and institutions like the United Nations. He championed progressive economics. Even as he failed morally on racial justice, he was a man of paradox, idealistic and stubborn visionary, and flawed, brilliant and blind parts of his own. Prejudice. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams. Picture a slender man in a high-backed chair, pen in hand, glasses perched at the edge of his nose, maps and treaties sprawled across his desk. He speaks softly, but carries the weight of a world in his words, because Woodrow Wilson believed that ideas could change nations, and that peace, though fragile, was worth fighting for with words as much as weapons. Warren G. Harding, the Shadow, and the Smile on November 2nd, 1865, in the quiet village of Blooming Grove, Ohio. A baby boy named Warren Gell Harding was born to a country doctor and a midwife mother raised in the rolling farmland of rural America. Young Warren grew up loving music, community, and newspapers. Harding wasn't a prodigy, but he was charismatic, warm, and endlessly likable. He graduated from Ohio Central College, then drifted into journalism, buying a struggling local paper in Marion, Ohio, and transforming it into a successful business. He soon married Florence King. Dee Wolfe, a strong-willed and ambitious woman who managed his finances and many would argue his career together. They became a local power couple, he with his charm, she with her savvy Harding's public appeal, his smooth baritone voice, his easy manner, and his dignified presence made him a natural in politics. He served in the Ohio State Senate, became lieutenant governor, and later was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1914. Harding was not known for bold ideas or fiery rhetoric. He was a conciliator, a man who preferred peace and compromise over conflict in a nation recovering from World War I and the emotional exhaustion of Wilsonian idealism that calmness was exactly what people wanted in 1920. The Republican Party needed a safe, unifying figure after several dramatic candidates failed to gain traction. They turned to Harding, a genial, uncontroversial senator with national appeal. His campaign slogan returned to normally resonated with Americans craving peace, simplicity, and a break from upheaval. Harding won by a landslide, defeating James M. Cox and becoming the 29th President of the United States. It was the first election in which women could vote nationwide, and Harding's easy charm won their M2. The early 1920s were a time of economic boom and cultural change. Jazz music saw automobiles roared and Americans wanted to enjoy life. He advocated for pro-business policies, reduced taxes, especially on corporations, and the wealthy established the Bureau of the Budget, improving government efficiency, supported immigration restrictions, signing the Emergency Quota Act. He appointed Charles Evans, Hughes, Andrew Mellon, and Herbert Hoover to key cabinet posts, men of substance and skill. But Harding also appointed friends and political cronies, members of the so-called Ohio Gang, many of whom were far less honorable. Harding's personal life was filled with contradiction. He was friendly, optimistic, and fond of poker and storytelling, but also prone to poor judgment in choosing associates. Several scandals would later rock his administration, the infamous Teapot Dome scandal involving the secret leasing of federal oil reserves for bribes, corruption in the Veterans Bureau, and the Justice Department, though there's no evidence. Harding personally profited from these schemes. He chose to trust the wrong people, and the consequences would stain his legacy privately. Harding was tormented by the unfolding corruption. He reportedly told a friend, "I can deal with my enemies, but my friends, my damn friends, they're the ones who keep me walking the floor at night." In 1923, Harding embarked on a cross-country tour he called the Voyage of Understanding to reconnect with the American people. But the stress of the presidency and perhaps his own internal guilt took its toll on August 2nd, 1923. While in San Francisco, Harding died suddenly of a heart attack. He was just 57, his death stunned the nation. Americans mourned the loss of a leader they saw as kind, comforting, and fatherly. At first, Harding was remembered warmly, but as the scandals emerged after his death, his reputation plummeted for decades. Historians ranked him among the worst presidents, yet in recent years, some have re-examined Harding's legacy. He was the first president to openly advocate for civil rights for African Americans, calling for equal education and political participation. He pardoned Eugene Debs, the socialist leader imprisoned under Wilson. He championed peace through disarmament, hosting the Washington Naval Conference, which limited battleship construction among world powers. He was a man of great empathy but limited control. A president who meant well but misjudged deeply. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, picture a man at a card table in the White House chuckling softly, a hand of aces tucked under his elbow, the smell of cigars curling into the chandelier. Light, he's charming, worn down and full of contradictions, because Warren G. Harding believed that healing mattered more than headlines, and though his shadows were many, his smile still reached the people. Calvin Coolidge. The quiet torch. Once upon a time in the green hills of Vermont, under skies filled with stillness and stars, a baby boy was born on July 4th, 1872, destined to become one of the quietest and most surprising leaders in American history. His name was John Calvin Coolidge Jr., but history would remember him simply as Cal, the man of few words and fierce convictions from the start. Calvin lived. Simply, he grew up in a small town called Plymouth Notch, where his father was a hard-working storekeeper constable and justice of the peace. His mother died when he was just 12. Her absence, like a whisper through the trees, never left him. It shaped his solemn soul, wrapping him in a quiet sadness that he carried with deep grace. Coolidge wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, he didn't charm rooms or roar with laughter, but what he was steady, thoughtful, a man who listened more than he spoke and who measured every word like it was gold dust. He went to Amherst College, where he blossomed intellectually, then studied law and entered politics ethics through the most traditional of doors. Small-town service dedication and sheer reliability. In an age of political bluster, Calvin Coolidge rose quietly but consistently from city councilman to mayor, then to state senator, lieutenant governor, and finally governor of Massachusetts. It was during his time as governor that the nation took notice. In 1999, the Boston police force went on strike and chaos broke out. Coolidge, calm and unshaken, called in the National Guard and refused to reinstate the striking officers. There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime, he said, firm, unwavering. It became a national quote, and just like that, the quiet man from Vermont was thrust into the national spotlight. In 1920, the Republican Party tapped him to be vice president under Warren G. Harding, and then fate intervened on August 2nd, 1923. President Harding died suddenly during a trip to the West Coolidge, visiting his family home in Vermont, was awakened in the middle of the night by a messenger in that humble farmhouse lit by a single kerosene lamp. His father, a notary, public administered the presidential oath of office in their sitting room. No grandeur, no headlines, just a father, a son, and a moment that changed history. Coolidge now found himself president of a nation still healing from World War I and rushing headfirst into the roaring 20s. From 1923 to 1929, Coolidge presided over one of the most economically prosperous periods in American history. He believed in limited government, low taxes, and staying out of people's way. His mantra, "The business of America is business," he reduced the national debt, cut government spending, and oversaw a booming stock market. Unemployment dropped, industry soared, and he resisted the temptation to interfere too much in the whirlwind growth of the time. Coolidge didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't crave approval. He held press conferences, but often gave reporters little more than a nod and a blink. Yet behind that cool exterior was a man who read poetry, adored animals, especially his beloved white colleague Rob Roy, and mourned privately when his teenage son, Calvin Jr., died suddenly in 1924. That tragedy nearly crushed him, but he carried on with quiet courage. Coolidge had a subtle sense of humor, dry as a New England winter. Once a woman at a dinner party told him she'd made a bet she could get more than 2 words out of him. His reply, "You lose, I his wife Grace." Coolidge was his opposite. Vivacious, warm, and utterly devoted to him. She softened his silence and brought light to the White House. Together they were a balance of restraint and charm. In 1928, Coolidge stunned the nation by choosing not to run for re-election. He believed deeply that 2 terms were enough. "I do not choose to run for president." In 1928, he said, and that was that he returned to private life, gave speeches, wrote his memoirs, and stayed out of the headlines. He died in 1933, just before the Great Depression swallowed the country. He'd helped shepherd through years of economic music boom. His legacy is often debated. Some see him as a hands-off president who missed warning signs. Others admire his humility, discipline, and respect for constitutional limits. What's certain is that Calvin Coolidge governed with an inner strength that didn't need a microphone. He was a man of silence. In an age of noise, a calm lighthouse during stormy growth. A figure who taught us that sometimes doing less means doing exactly enough. And so in the gentle stillness of our bedtime story, we leave Silent Cal under the Vermont stars, his legacy echoing in every deliberate pause, every thoughtful decision, and every dream of quieter, steadier days. Herbert Hoover, the weight of kindness. Once upon a time in the wind, swept fields of Iowa, a small boy with kind eyes and a quiet spirit was born on August 10th, 1874. His name was Herbert Clark Hoover, and though the world would one day remember him as the president who faced down the Great Depression, his story began with the aching silence of loss. Both of Herbert's parents died before he turned 10, orphaned and adrift. Young Herbert was sent west to live with an uncle in Oregon. It was there, among the misty forests and stoic silence of the Pacific Northwest, that he learned the value of work, humility, and perseverance. He didn't speak much, but when he did, he meant it. Herbert Hoover wasn't born into privilege, but he carved his way toward it with raw determination. He enrolled in Stanford University as part of its very first class. In 1891, studying geology, money was tight. He worked odd jobs, stoking furnaces, doing laundry, and even managing the football team. But grit was his second language after graduation. Hoover became a mining engineer, traveling across the globe, Australia, China, and beyond, managing operations and amassing a tidy fortune. He was known not just for his technical brilliance, but for his fair treatment of workers, a rarity in his era. And yet, as his wealth grew, so did his compassion. When World War I erupted, Hoover transformed from wealthy engineer to global humanitarian Ian. In 1914, he organized relief for Americans stranded in Europe. That same year, he launched the Commission for Relief in Belgium, delivering food to millions of civilians trapped behind enemy lines. It was the largest humanitarian effort the world had ever seen. One Belgian child called him the man who fed us when no one else would. By the end of the war, he had fed not just Belgium, but Poland, Austria, Armenia, and more people began calling him the great humanitarian. President Woodrow Wilson took notice and made Hoover the U.S. Food Administrator, asking Americans to Hooverize by conserving food. And they did voluntarily because they trusted him, despite his immense popularity. Hoover didn't want to be a politician, but the country wanted him after serving the Secretary of Commerce under President Harding, and Coolidge Hoover reluctantly accepted the Republican nomination for president. In 1928, he ran on a message of prosperity and efficiency, and it worked. He won by landslide only months into his preside presidency. The world shifted beneath his feet in October 1929. The stock market crashed. Banks failed, jobs disappeared, families lost everything. What began as an economic slump quickly spiraled into the Great Depression, the worst in U.S. history. Hoover, the brilliant organizer and rescuer of Europe, now faced a disaster at home. And though he tried to help creating public works programs, encouraging business cooperation, and forming relief loans, he believed deeply in limited government and voluntary action. Not direct federal aid to a nation desperate for food and jobs. His restraint felt like indifference. Prosperity is just around the corner, he insisted, but that corner never came. Shanty towns sprang up and were mockingly dubbed Hoovervilles. The once great humanitarian now found himself vilified, a man out of step with the desperate mood of the country. But Hoover was not heartless. He was overwhelmed, haunted. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, refusing to take a salary as president and donating large portions of his fortune to relief efforts. But the public wanted immediate, visible help, and in that Hoover's philosophical restraint became his political undoing. In 1932, he lost re-election in a landslide to Franklin D. Roosevelt. He left office defeated, exhausted, and deeply misunderstood. Yet Hoover's story didn't end there. He lived for 31 more years, becoming one of the longest-lived former presidents in history. And in that time, he quietly rebuilt his reputation, not as a political figure, but as a public servant. President Truman, decades later, asked Hoover to lead post-War II food relief efforts in Europe, once again the man who had fed the world. Once before war, now returned to feed it again, older, wiser, and still moved by compassion. He also chaired the Hoover Commission aimed at making the federal government more efficient. He kept writing, thinking, and serving until the very end. Herbert Hoover died on October 20th, 1964. At the age of 90 by then, time had softened the edges of public judgment. People remembered the orphan who became a global humanitarian, the engineer who helped feed nations, the man who, though not a successful president, had been a remarkable human being, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the fireside light. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882, in the grand Whispering Hills of Hyde Park, New York, a place of rolling trees, Hudson River winds, and wealth as quiet as the carpets underfoot. He was the only child of James Roosevelt, a wealthy railroad vice president, and Sarah Delano Roosevelt, a fiercely devoted mother whose influence would stretch far beyond his childhood. He was raised not to work, but to lead. He spoke French before he could properly ride a horse. Tutors were brought in. Latin was served at breakfast, and summers were spent in Europe. He sailed red, endlessly and wore silk shirts pressed with maternal precision. He was a golden boy, a chosen one from a family that spoke in calm tones and dined under chandeliers, and yet privilege doesn't prevent destiny from testing you. At Harvard University, Franklin was charming but not academic. He was more drawn to the buzz of conversation than the pages of textbooks he edited. The Harvard Crimson smiled a lot and made connections. It was also during this time that he became captivated by his distant cousin, the magnetic mustachio president, Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy's swagger lit something in Franklin, a belief that he too could be a leader, not just an observer. He went on to attend Columbia Law School. Though he found the law dull, the bar exam was passed more from effort than passion. Still, he was now a lawyer, a young gentleman with ambition and an elegant gait. In 1905, he married Eleanor Roosevelt, his fifth cousin, once removed in a wedding that would change the course of the nation. Eleanor was brilliant, shy, and observant. Her uncle, none other than President Theodore Roosevelt, walked her down the aisle. Together they were mismatched, but destined. Franklin was sunny, smooth, and social. Eleanor was serious, sensitive, and independent. Their bond was sometimes romantic, sometimes painful, but always profound. Politics came naturally to Franklin. In 1910, he was elected to the New York State Senate. His name, his charm, and his confidence made him a rising star in the Democratic Party. Then came Washington under President Woodrow Wilson. Franklin was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In 1913, he adored the job. He loved the power, the uniforms, the sense of mission. During World War I, he modernized the Navy, visited war fronts, and dreamed of following Wilson into the White House one day. In 1920, he ran as the Democratic vice presidential candidate. They lost, but no matter. Franklin was now a household name. The spotlight had found him. And then everything changed in 1921 while vacationing at Campobello Island. Franklin Roosevelt was struck down by a sudden fever within days. He could no longer walk, the diagnosis polio. He was 39 years old. It was not just a physical blow, it was existential. A man bred for motion, now paralyzed from the waist down. Many thought his career was over. A crippled man could not be president, but Franklin refused to surrender. He spent years fighting water therapy, metal braces, sheer will. He never walked unaided again, but he trained himself to appear as though he could. He taught himself how to stand, how to grip podiums tightly enough to hear the truth behind closed doors. He struggled, but in public he smiled, and through pain he found empathy in his suffering. Roosevelt became not just a leader, but a human leader, one who understood pain, fear, and the quiet despair of everyday people. Polio didn't end his life, it forged his soul. In 1928, he became governor of New York. His leadership during the early days of the Great Depression was bold and compassionate relief programs, public works, direct aid. He believed government could and should help. By 1932, the country was drowning in economic collapse. President Hoover seemed helpless. Banks failed, unemployment soared, breadlines wrapped around city blocks. The people needed hope, and they turned to Roosevelt. He won in a landslide in March 1933. Franklin Delano Roosevelt became President of the United States. In the first 100 days of his presidency, Roosevelt passed an avalanche of legislation: the New Deal, banking reform forms, emergency relief, massive infrastructure projects. Programs like the CCC, WPA, TVA, and FDIC were born. He created Social Security. He put people to work. He gave speeches called fireside chats. speaking directly to the American people via radio, his warm voice offering reassurance in their living room. He didn't fix everything, but he made people believe again. He was elected 4 times, the only president to serve more than 2 terms. And through it all, the Depression, the Dust Bowl, the rise of fascism, he stayed calm, confident, and determined. Then came war. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, World War II began. Roosevelt tried to keep America neutral, but he knew it would come for them eventually, and it did. On December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, Roosevelt gave one of the most iconic speeches in history, a date which will live in infamy. The US entered the war, and Roosevelt became a wartime president. He worked with Churchill, and Stalin created the Lend-Lease Act, mobilized American industry, and led the Allies toward victory. Behind the scenes, his health was fading. He looked older, thinner, worn. Still, he ran for a 4th term in 1944. When won in April 1945, just months into his 4th term, Roosevelt traveled to Warm Springs, Georgia, his beloved polio retreat. On April 12, 1945, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died at the age of 63. The world mourned, soldiers wept openly. Ordinary people cried in kitchens, on farms, and in factories. Vice President Harry S. Truman said it best. He belonged to the world, to history, and to us. Franklin D. Roosevelt changed the presidency forever. He made it a force for direct action. He believed that government had a duty to care for the people, not as a handout, but as a promise. He led America through its darkest economic hours and into the dawn of victory in the largest war ever fought. His face is on the D, his words still echo, and his courage behind a podium, behind a smile, behind paralyzed legs, remains one of the most powerful testaments to resilience ever written. Harry S. Truman. The buck stops here. Born on May 8, 1884, in Lamar, Missouri, Harry Truman arrived with no fanfare, no destined legacy, no silver spoon. His parents, John and Martha Truman, were humble farmers. The middle initial S didn't even stand for anything, just to nod to both his grandfathers Solomon and Ship. As a child, Harry was quiet, kind, and endlessly curious. He wore thick glasses and read vet graciously Plutarch, the Bible, Shakespeare history books. He played the piano beautifully. He adored his mother and often quoted her words, "Be good, Harry." He worked on the family farm for years, plowing fields, tending crops, and building a quiet resilience. No one expected him to become president, not even him in World War. Harry volunteered for the army. Despite his poor eyesight, he trained in Oklahoma, where he learned how to command respect, not with force, but with fairness sent to France. In 1918, he led a battery of artillerymen in combat under fire. Truman proved brave and steady. His men respected him. He wrote heartfelt letters home to his beloved Bess Wallace, his childhood crush. Since age 6, after the war, he returned to Missouri and married Bess. He opened Habashi, a men's clothing store, with a friend, but after a brief success, it failed in the early 1920s. Still, Truman refused to declare bankruptcy. He paid off his debts over 15 years, every cent. He had no money, no job, and no real future in sight. And then came politics. Truman was pulled into politics by Tom Pendergast, a powerful Kansas City political boss. He wasn't proud of the connection, but it gave him his start. He was elected as a county judge, and later in 1934 became a U.S. senator in Washington. People underestimated him, this plain-spoken man from Missouri. But he listened, he worked hard, and during World War II, he led the Truman Committee investigating defense spending and saving the country billions of dollars, he became known as honest, practical, relentless. By 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt needed a new vice president. Party leaders chose Truman, a safe, modest man with few enemies. He accepted humbly. He served 82 days as vice president. Then, on April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died, and Harry became president. It was said that when Eleanor Roosevelt told Truman the news of FDR's death, he asked her, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble." Now, indeed, he was. The war in Europe was nearly over. But in the Pacific, the Japanese refused to surrender, and on his desk lay a secret, the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. Truman had barely known of its existence before becoming president. Now he alone had to decide whether to use it. On August 6, 1945, the first bomb fell on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki, the world changed forever. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. Truman's decision remains one of the most debated in history. But to him, it was simple, and the war saved lives, stopped future suffering. He never apologized. He bore it as a soldier, bears weight with quiet endurance. With the war over, Truman now faced the peace. He helped found the United Nations. He supported the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe. He recognized the State of Israel. He implemented the Truman Doctrine, pledging support to nations threatened by communism. He desegregated the U.S. military, a bold and moral act that laid foundations for the civil rights movement. He ran for re-election in 1948, despite being mocked, as unelectable newspapers even printed early editions proclaiming his defeat. And yet he won against all odds, a stunning upset. He held up that famous newspaper, "We defeats Truman," with a grin as wide as Missouri. The Cold War began to settle over the world like a frost. The Berlin airlift saved a city from starvation. The Korean War broke out in 1950. Truman committed troops without a formal declaration of war, starting a precedent that would echo for decades. Domestically, he clashed with Congress. He vetoed bills. He fought for national health insurance but failed to pass it. He faced strikes criticism and deepening Cold War fear. But through it all, he stayed true to his sign. The buck stops here. No excuses, no blame. Shifting, just leadership. In 1952, Truman chose not to run again. He returned to Missouri with Bess to a simple house in Independence, where he walked daily, wrote his memoirs by hand, and insisted on answering his own telephone. He lived modestly, refusing to cash in on his fame. He had no presidential pension. He even paid for his own postage stamps. He died on December 26th, 1972, at the age of 88, and a nation mourned. Harry Truman wasn't flashy. He wasn't charismatic, but he was honest, courageous, and utterly human. He took the toughest job in the world and led with conscience. He made history, not with ego, but with duty, and in time, history judged him not as a caretaker, but as a builder, a moral compass, a president who stood up, made the hard calls, and never looked away. Dwight David Eisenhower, the gentle General Dwight David Eisenhower, called Ike since he was a baby, was born on October 14, 1890, in Denison, Texas, but it was the flat farmlands of Abilene, Kansas that shaped him. One of 7 brothers, Ike was raised in a working-class family with deep religious values and a strong sense of personal discipline. His mother, Ida, was gentle but firm, while his father, David, was quiet and reserved. Life wasn't easy. The Eisenhowers lived modestly, sharing chores, hand-me-downs, and dreams. Young Ike loved history fishing. and of course football. He had a temper, once punching a tree until his knuckles bled after being denied permission to go trick-or-treating. But he also had humility, once choosing to repeat a school year rather than let a younger brother fall behind. Alone, leadership was already in his blood in 1911 after a few misfires in his career path. Eisenhower secured a spot at West Point Military Academy. There he wasn't at the top of his class, but he impressed professors with his balance of logic, charm, and sheer perseverance. He graduated in 1915, joining what many later called the class the Stars Felon, a generation of officers destined to become generals. World War I was raging by the time Ike was commissioned, but to his frustration, he never saw combat. Instead, he trained tank crews at home and studied military theory. With quiet obsession, he married M. Dow in 1916, a socialite from Iowa, with a sharp wit and infinite patience. Their marriage was full of mutual affection, long separations, and shared resilience. They had 2 sons, one of whom died young, leaving a scar. Ike never spoke of. It wasn't until World War II that Eisenhower became a household name, though he'd never led troops in battle. His brilliance in logistics coordination and diplomacy caught the attention of top brass, including General George Marshall, who saw in him the future of Allied command by 1943. Eisenhower was named Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. It was his job to unify American, British, French, Canadian, and countless other forces managing egos the size of continents, while planning the most complex military operation in history, day on June 6, 1944, under Ike's command. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The invasion was brutal, bloody, and decisive. It cracked Hitler's grip on Europe and changed the course of the war. And before the battle, Eisenhower, ever humble, wrote a letter. Accepting full responsibility in case it failed, it didn't fail. The world hailed him as a hero. After the war, Eisenhower served briefly as president of Columbia University. Then, as the first supreme commander of NATO, he was loved not just in America but around the world, praised for his fairness, warmth, and unshakable calm. Both political parties begged him to run for president. He chose the Republican Party, and in 1952, with the slogan, "I like Ike," plastered across the country, he won the election by a landslide. He had never held elected office before, but he knew how to lead Eisenhower's presidency. 1953 to 1961 was marked not by fiery speeches or sweeping ideology, but by quiet competence. He balanced the budget, he kept America out of war. He negotiated peace in Korea, he warned against nuclear escalation, and advocated for diplomacy over aggression. At home, he expanded Social Security, supported the GI Bill, and signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, creating the interstate highway system, the largest public works project in U.S. history. He enforced school desegregation, sending federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to protect black students entering a previously all-white school. He didn't shout slogans, he acted. He was the kind of leader who believed stability itself was a form of strength. And yet under that calm exterior was a keen awareness of danger. He warned America of a rising military-industrial complex in his farewell address, cautioning the country not to lose its soul to endless arms races and profit-driven warfare. Eisenhower left the presidency in 1961 and returned to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to a simple farmhouse with M, he wrote. His memoirs played golf and received endless visitors, soldiers, presidents, admirers. When John F. Kennedy was inaugurated, Eisenhower stood proudly behind him, grateful respectful, and quietly symbolic of the transition from war to youth. He died on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78. His last words were, "I want to go. God take me." Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a thunderous man. He didn't crave adoration, but he held the world together. At its most fragile moments, he planned. He built highways that stitched a nation. He guided the Cold War with a steady hand, and when the weight of leadership was too heavy for others, he carried it lightly. He remains one of the most admired presidents in U.S. history, a man of quiet dignity, calm courage, and an enduring belief that peace was something you had to plan for every day. John F. Kennedy, the spark of Camelot. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917 in Brookline, Massachusetts, into a world of polished shoes, Harvard ties, and whispered expectations. He was the second son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a wealthy businessman and political power broker, and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, the daughter of a mayor. The Kennedys were more than just rich. They were building something, a dynasty, a legacy. But young Jack, as his family called him, was sickly and small illness plagued his childhood, scarlet fever, back issues, digestive problems. And yet his spirit sparkled. He read voraciously. He had a sharp wit, and a rogue's grin charm came to him like breathing. While his older brother Joe Jr. was groomed to be president, Jack was seen as the clever second son until destiny changed its mind. Jack attended Harvard University, studying international affairs and writing an honors thesis that would later become a best-selling book, Why England Slept. He was fascinated by politics, power, and history's great turning points. Then came World War II. Jack joined the Navy commanding a patrol torpedo boat PT-109 in the Pacific. In 1943, his boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer, leaving his crew stranded in shark-infested waters. Injured, Jack swam miles while dragging a wounded sailor by his life jacket strap held in his teeth. They survived. He returned a hero, but with chronic back pain that would haunt him for life. He barely spoke of his valor. He didn't need to in 1946. After Joe Jr. was tragically killed in combat, Jack was propelled into the political arena. He ran for Congress and won, then the Senate. Then in 1953, he married Jacqueline Bouvier, a sophisticated journalist, an icon in the making. Together they were elegant, magnetic, and unmistakably modern behind closed doors. Jack battled Addison's disease and lived on daily injections, but in public, he shined. He was witty, polished, and full of poetic idealism. His speeches stirred the soul. He spoke not just to minds, but to hearts. In 1960, at just 43 years old, he ran for president against Richard Nixon. He was young, Catholic, charismatic. In the first ever televised debates, his calm confidence contrasted Nixon's pale, sweaty nervousness. The nation fell in love, and he won by one of the slimmest margins in U.S. history. John F. Kennedy was inaugurated. He was inaugurated on January 20th, 1961. Snow dusted the Capitol. Robert Frost recited poetry, and Jack gave a speech that would echo for generations. Ask not what your country can do for you. The White House came alive. With Jackie Kennedy's grace, the nation watched concerts, state dinners, and glittering art, they called it. Camelot, a fleeting era of youth culture and hope. But the presidency was no fairy tale. In his first months, he faced the Bay of Pigs, a failed CIA invasion of Cuba that embarrassed the administration. Jack took full responsibility. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Soviet missiles in Cuba, tense negotiations, military advisors urging attack. But Jack held the line. He chose diplomacy, blockade, and calm communication with Khrushchev, and the world stepped back from the brink. He emerged stronger, wiser, unshaken. JFK launched the space race, promising to send a man to the moon before the decade's end. It was bold, expensive, daring. But to him, it symbolized possibility back on Earth. The civil rights movement swelled. JFK was cautious at first, careful not to lose Southern support. But over time, especially under pressure from leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., he stepped forward in 1963. He delivered a national address on civil rights. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. It was a turning point. He proposed the Civil Rights Act and began to shift the soul of the nation on November 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy rode in an open-top car through Dallas, Texas, waving smiling Jackie by his side in pink at 12:30 p.m. Shots rang out. He was struck twice. The motorcade raced to Parkland Hospital, but it was too late. He was 46 years old. The nation was shattered. People wept in streets. Children asked if the world was ending. Jackie refused to change out of her blood-stained suit. Let them see what they've done, she said. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office just hours later. Aboard Air Force One, Camelot was gone. John F. Kennedy was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery beneath an eternal flame that Jackie herself lit in death. He became more than a man. He became a symbol of youth, of possibility, of dreams unfinished. His vision for civil rights was carried forward by LBJ. His moonshot dream was fulfilled. In 1969, his words still echo in speeches, classrooms, and hearts around the world. He was flawed, complex, both brilliant and reckless. He kept secrets, took risks, lived with pain, but through it all, he inspired. He made people believe they could serve, building dream. Lyndon B. Johnson, the relentless reformer. Lyndon Baines. Johnson was born on August 27th, 1908, in a small farmhouse near Stonewall, Texas, a land of dust, stubborn roots, and hard-earned sunrises. His father, Sam Johnson, had once been a Texas legislator, but financial missteps left the family nearly penniless. Lyon grew up helping on the farm, barefoot at times, scrappy, quick-witted, and fiercely observant. He saw poverty up close. He saw injustice, and unlike others who were hardened by it, he remembered it. He carried it like a spark in his chest. He attended Southwest Texas State Teachers College and taught poor Mexican-American children in tiny classrooms, where he saw how hunger and hopelessness, potential, it lit a fire in him. He didn't just want power, he wanted to use it. By 1937, Johnson won a seat in Congress during the New Deal era and quickly aligned himself with Franklin D. Roosevelt, whom he idolized. FDR affectionately called him Landslide Lyndon, a cheeky jab at the razor thin margin by which he'd won. Lyndon was tireless. He worked day and night learning the system inside and out. He charmed, bullied, bargained, and boomed. He called in favors like thunder calls down rain. In 1948, he won a controversial Senate seat, again by a whisker, just 87 votes earning, whispers of fraud, and a new nickname, Landslide. Lyndon now with a wink. Once in the Senate, he rose like a rocket. By 1954, he became Senate Majority Leader, the youngest in history, and not just in title. He ran the Senate, he twisted arms, flipped votes, and read people like pages in a book. He was rough, he was brilliant, he was unforgettable. When John F. Kennedy asked LBJ to be his running mate in 1960, it was seen as a strange match. Kennedy was young elite, and Northern Johnson was older, earthy, and pure Texas. but the partnership helped win the South as vice president. However, Johnson was sidelined. JFK's inner circle mocked his style. LBJ, used to commanding rooms, found himself in shadows. He hated it, but he waited, and then on November 22nd, 1963, everything changed. Kennedy was assassinated and Lyndon B. Johnson became president just hours after JFK's death. Johnson took the oath aboard Air Force One with Jackie Kennedy beside him in her bloodstained suit. He was calm, somber, steady. He promised continuity, but what came next was nothing short of revolution in Kennedy's honor, and held by his own ambition. Johnson threw the full weight of the presidency behind a vision grander than any, since FDR, the Great Society LBJ, launched a sweeping agenda aimed at ending poverty and promoting racial justice. He passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, banning segregation in public places, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, protecting Black Americans at the ballot box, Medicare and Medicaid giving health care to the elderly and poor, the war on poverty, expanding education, food assistance and job training. It was ambitious, expansive, compassionate. He said this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. And for a while it worked. Poverty rates dropped, doors opened, hope returned to communities long forgotten. But history is never kind enough to leave a legacy unchallenged. As Johnson waged a war on poverty at home, another war was escalating abroad. Vietnam initially, small scope. The US presence ballooned under Johnson. He feared letting communism spread. He feared being seen as weak. He remembered how Truman had been blamed for losing China, so he sent more troops. By 1968, over 500,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. Televised images showed burning villages and flag-draped coffins. Protests erupted. Students marched. Cities boiled. Johnson was heartbroken. He once said, "I can't get out, I can't finish it, and I can't win it." The war consumed his presidency. It eclipsed his great society. It drained his soul. On March 31st, 1968, he shocked the nation. I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term. As your president, LBJ retired to his beloved ranch in Texas, where the land whispered and the rivers rolled. He wrote his memoirs, smoked heavily, and watched the country from a distance, still proud but weary, still dreaming of what could have been. He died of a heart attack on January 22nd, 1973. Just one day after what would have been his second term's end. Lyndon B. Johnson remains one of the most complicated presidents in history. He lifted millions out of poverty, gave rights to the voiceless, transformed healthcare, and redefined government's role in human dignity. And yet he also resided over one of America's most divisive wars, leaving a nation fractured and grieving. He used power not as decoration, but as a tool, a force, a responsibility. Richard M. Nixon, Richard Milhouse. Nixon was born on January 9th, 1931, in a small home in Yorba Linda, California, a modest place that smelled of lemons, hard work, and quiet dreams. His parents, Francis and Hannah Nixon, were stern and devout. Quakers. Money was tight. Two of Nixon's brothers died young, and grief hung in the family home like heavy drape. Young Richard grew up in the shadows of loss. He was brilliant, but shy, sensitive yet fiercely ambitious. He hated losing. He wasn't flashy, but he was sharp, razor sharp. He earned a scholarship to Harvard, but couldn't afford the travel or expenses. Instead, he went to Whittier College, where he developed a reputation as a debater who could outthink anyone, even if they didn't like him very much. He studied law, served in the Navy during World War II, and returned home not with medals but with grit. He was ready to rise in 1946. Nixon ran for Congress, a fresh-faced veteran with fire in his belly and a love for strategy. He made a name for himself as an aggressive anti-communist, helping expose a Soviet spy ring in the Aleris case. Then came the Senate, then the vice presidency under Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was young, loyal, tireless, but also awkward. The press disliked him. He sweated on camera. His grin looked forced. People sensed something closed off behind his eyes, yet he was brilliant when accused of misusing campaign funds. He gave the famous Checker speech in 1952, emotional, calculated, and masterful. He saved his career by appealing directly to the public, even mentioning the family dog, Checkers. He stayed on the ticket. He served as vice president for 8 years, respected but never beloved. In 1960, Nixon ran for president against the dazzling John F. Kennedy. The televised debate B changed everything. Kennedy appeared confident and elegant. Nixon, pale and sweating, looked tired. He lost narrowly, painfully. Then in 1962, he ran for governor of California and lost again, humiliated, bitter and furious. He told reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." It seemed the end, but Nixon never stayed down for long. In 1968, as America burned with war protests and assassinations, Nixon returned. This time he ran as the candidate of law and order. He promised to end the war in Vietnam, bring peace at home, and restore dignity to the presidency. And this time he won. He became the 37th President of the United States. The comeback was complete in foreign policy. Nixon was exceptional. With his brilliant advisor, Henry Kissinger, he reshaped the global order. In 1972, he made a historic trip to China, opening diplomatic relations. After decades of silence, he signed major arms reduction treaties with the Soviet Union. He pulled US troops from Vietnam, replacing them with a policy called Vietnamization. It was cautious, calculated, strategic at his peak. Nixon was seen as one of the most effective foreign policy presidents in US history. But at home, a storm was brewing. In 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. It seemed minor at first, but behind the scenes there was a cover-up, and behind the cover-up was the president. As journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein dug deeper, as courts issued subpoenas, and as staff began to resign, the truth began to unfold. Like poison paper, Nixon had recorded conversations in the Oval Office. The tapes proved he tried to obstruct justice. His words, once powerful, became incriminating. As the walls closed in his own party began to turn. Congress prepared for impeachment. Nixon knew he couldn't survive it. On August 8, 1974, he became the first U.S. president to resign. The next day, he boarded Marine One, waved a stiff farewell, and disappeared into the clouds. Gerald Ford, his successor, issued a full pardon, a decision that divided the country, but it spared Nixon a trial for years. Nixon lived in quiet exile in California, writing books, giving interviews, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, rehabilitating his image by the time of his death. In 1994, he had regained some respect. Foreign leaders praised his mind. Presidents quietly sought his advice, but the scars remained. Richard Nixon is a story of contradiction. He created the Environmental Protection Agency. He advanced civil rights. Quietly, he reimagined global diplomacy, and yet he abused power, he distrusted democracy, he fell by his own hand. His story is a Shakespearean tale, the rise of a brilliant man crushed not by enemies, but by himself. Gerald R. Ford, the calm after the storm he was born. Leslie Lynch King Jr. on July 14, 1913 in Omaha, Nebraska. But don't worry, history wasn't about to let that name stick. His parents divorced shortly after his birth. His biological father was abusive, and his mother remarried a kind, hard-working paint salesman named Gerald Rudolph Ford. The young boy was renamed Gerald R. Ford Jr. after the man who raised him. He grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with footballs in his hands and calm in his heart, steady, reliable, honest. The kind boy who returned lost wallets and said, "Sir." Without being asked, he excelled in school, worked as a lifeguard, and captained the University of Michigan football team. He was offered spots in the NFL, but turned them down. Instead, he chose law and service. Ford studied at Yale Law School, served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and returned home with quiet medals and acquired a sense of responsibility. In 1948, he married the vibrant and outspoken Betty Bloomer, a dancer turned activist who would become one of the most beloved first ladies in history. That same year, Ford ran for Congress and won. He'd go on to serve 25 years in the House of Representatives, never losing an election. He was never flashy, never scandalous, but always reliable. He became House Minority Leader, respected by both parties for his decency, integrity, and stubborn sense of what was right. He never sought glory, he sought balance. And then history came calling in 1973, after Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned due to corruption. President Richard Nixon nominated Ford to take his place. It was a surprise he was chosen. For one reason, trust the Senate confirmed him overwhelmingly. Then, just 8 months later, Nixon resigned, and on August 9, 1974, Gerald Ford became President of the United States, the only person in history to assume both the vice presidency and presidency without being elected to either. He stepped into the Oval Office and spoke plainly, "I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president by your ballots. So I ask you to confirm me with your prayers." America was raw. The Watergate scandal had left the public disillusioned, angry, and exhausted. Trust in government was at an all-time low. Ford's mission wasn't grand reform, it was healing. And then he made the boldest move of his presidency. He pardoned Richard Nixon. He believed the nation needed to move forward, that trials and headlines and more, scandal would rip the country apart. The decision was deeply unpopular. His approval ratings plumed. Critics accused him of making a back row deal, but he didn't flinch. He wrote in his diary, "I was prepared to go down in the polls if it meant doing what I thought was right." He did go down in the polls, but history would eventually forgive him. The economy was struggling. Inflation, unemployment, and energy shortages low loomed. Ford tried. He launched the WIN program, Whip Inflation Now, and vetoed more than 50 bills in an effort to curb government spending. He worked with Congress. Despite a Democratic majority, he kept the country steady through international turmoil, Cold War tensions, and the fall of South Vietnam in 1975, but the wounds of Watergate ran deep. In 1976, he faced a fierce challenge from within his own party, Ronald Reagan, and then lost the general election narrowly to Jimmy Carter. Still, when he left office, his approval had recovered. Many saw in him the thing the country had most needed: stability. Gerald Ford retired to Palm Springs, gave speeches, and wrote his memoirs. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award, and the respect of many who once criticized him. He lived a long life. Loved Betty watched his children grow and stayed involved always as the quiet voice of reason when he passed away on December 26th, 2006. At the age of 93, the nation mourned a good man who had done a difficult job at the hardest of times. Gerald Ford may not be remembered for grand speeches or sweeping reforms, but he should be remembered for this. He restored faith, he led with humility, he made decisions that hurt himself in order to heal the nation, and in a time of rage, scandal and disillusionment, he chose Grace Jimmy Carter. The peacemaker, President James Earl. Carter Jr. was born on October 1st, 1924, in the rural town of Plains, Georgia, a place so small you could blink and miss it, yet big enough to cradle a future president. He was the first president born in a hospital, but don't let that fool you. Jimmy grew up without electricity or running water until he was a teenager. His father, James Sr., was a stern but fair farmer and businessman. His mother, Lillian, was a compassionate nurse who treated people of all races, often without charge, at a time and place where that was not just rare but radical. From an early age, Carter absorbed both his father's discipline and his mother's empathy. He worked on the family peanut farm, mending fences, tending crops, and watching the world from behind gentle, curious eyes. He grew up in the deeply segregated South, but unlike many of his peers, Carter questioned what he saw. He believed in justice before he had the words for it. A gifted student, Jimmy enrolled at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he graduated in 1946. In the top 10% of his class, he married Rosalind Smith shortly after his childhood neighbor, lifelong love, and the woman who would become his quiet partner. In both politics and purpose, he served as a nuclear engineer in the Navy under Admiral Hayman Rickover, an experience that instilled in him precision, responsibility, and an obsession with detail. He might have had a long naval career, if not for tragedy. In 1953, his father died of cancer. Jimmy resigned from the Navy, packed up his young family, and returned to Plains to take over the family peanut farm, just as his father had done before him. But farming didn't quiet his restless mind. Politics came calling. In 1962, Carter was elected to the Georgia State Senate as a white man in the Jim Crow South. He took a brave stance by refusing to align with segregationists. His moral compass was locked on justice, and that didn't always win him friends. In 1970, he ran for governor of Georgia, though used coded appeals to win the election. He stunned the state in his inaugural address by declaring, "The time for racial discrimination is over." It was a turning point. He reformed the state's government focused on civil rights, environmental policy, and education, and quickly gained national attention as a Southern Democrat who didn't wear hate on his sleeve. By 1976, after the trauma of Wargate, Americans were desperate for honesty, and who better than a soft-spoken, born-again peanut farmer with a dazzling smile and zero ties to Washington? Jimmy Carter defeated Gerald Ford in a close election, and on January 20th, 1977, he became the 39th President of the United States. He famously walked down Pennsylvania Avenue during his inauguration, holding Rosalind's hand. Instead of riding in a limousine, he wanted to show the people he was with them, not above them, and he meant it. Carter dove into his presidency with idealism, intelligence, and relentless energy. He created the Department of Energy and Department of Education. He deregulated airlines and trucking, boosting competition. He pushed for human rights abroad, reshaping U.S. foreign policy. He installed solar panels on the White House roof. He wore cardigans and encouraged Americans to conserve energy. He was the first to speak about climate change as a genuine threat. And then he made history. In 1978, Carter brokered a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, two nations that had fought multiple wars. He invited Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to Camp David, the presidential retreat there. Over 13 agonizing days, Carter walked between the two men like a shepherd, negotiating, listening, pleading the result, the Camp David Accords, a treaty that ended decades of hostilities and brought peace to the Middle East, at least for a time. Carter considered it his proudest achievement, and the world agreed he would later win the Nobel Peace Prize, but not yet, because back home, trouble was brewing despite his achievements. Carter's presidency was plagued by mounting crises. The energy crisis sent gas prices soaring, inflation and unemployment rose, creating an economic storm. His approval ratings dropped. His honesty felt like helplessness. Then came Iran in 1979. The Iranian Revolution overthrew the US-backed Shah. His Islamic revolutionaries stormed the US embassy in Tann, taking 52 American hostages. Carter refused to abandon diplomacy. He tried every peaceful solution. He authorized a rescue mission that tragically failed. The hostages remained captive for 444 days, a national trauma broadcast on every screen. The Americans saw a kind man, but one they feared was ineffective. In 1980, Carter lost re-election to Ronald Reagan in a landslide. The hostages were released minutes after Reagan's inauguration, salt in an already open wound. If his presidency was turbulent, his post-presidency was transformational. Carter founded the Carter Center, working on disease eradication, especially guinea worm disease, promoting free elections across the globe, mediating conflicts on nearly every continent, championing human rights and affordable housing. He even built homes with Habitat for Humanity. Well into his 90s, in 2002, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his decades of humanitarian work. He taught Sunday school, he wrote 30-plus books, he painted, he gardened. He became what many consider the most admirable and impactful former president in history. Even after being diagnosed with brain cancer at 90, he kept working, smiling, and showing up. He became not just respected, but beloved. Jimmy Carter didn't crave power. He carried it lightly, like a farmer carries seeds. He wasn't perfect. He made political missteps. He sometimes seemed too soft for a brutal world. But he led with morality, with faith, with empathy. And in a time of cynicism, he reminded the world that decent matters. Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, Ronald Wilson Reagan, was born on February 6, 1911, in the small town of Tampo, Illinois, a sleepy speck in the Midwest, where winters were long and dreams felt far away. His father, Jack Reagan, was a struggling shoe salesman with Irish roots and a knack for storytelling. His mother, Nell, was a devout and compassionate woman who passed on to Ron both her faith and her sense of idealism. They called him Dutch as a child because of his round little face, and haircut money was always tight, and Jack battled alcoholism but had made sure their sons grew up with books, hope, and a belief in goodness. Young Ronnie didn't just read books, he acted them out. He was the kind of kid who could turn a snowstorm into Shakespeare. After graduating from Eureka College, where he studied economics and sociology and starred in theater productions. Of course, Reagan became a radio sports announcer. He had a golden voice and the kind of delivery that made even a baseball game feel like a war epic. Then, in 1937, while in California to cover the Cubs' spring training, he took a screen test with Warner Brothers And Hollywood said yes. He starred in over 50 films, mostly as the charming everyman or noble soldier, his most famous role playing George Gipp in New to Rocker, All-American, which earned him the nickname the Gipper, nickname he'd ride all the way to the White House. Thank you very much. He wasn't the biggest star in Hollywood, but he was beloved, reliable, familiar. And behind the scenes, he was changing. Reagan had started out as a Democrat, a supporter of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the New Deal. But as the years passed and as the Cold War took hold, he shifted. He grew increasingly wary of big government unions and communism. His politics moved right, but his heart remained sunny. He became a spokesman for General Electric, traveling the country giving speeches about the American dream, free enterprise and individual freedom. These talks were polished, passionate and pure. Reagan in 1962, he officially switched parties, saying, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The party left me," and the stage was set in 1966. Ronald Reagan ran for governor of California. Critics scoffed an actor, but the people saw a leader. He won in a landslide, serving 2 terms, and surprising many with his seriousness and discipline. He cut spending, he battled protests, he proved he could govern. And quietly, in the background, his eyes were on Washington. Reagan ran for president in 1976, challenging incumbent Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination. He lost narrowly, but gained national attention for his grace, passion, and powerful speech at the GOP convention. Then came 1980 amid economic woes, inflation, and the Iran hostage crisis. America was tired, disillusioned, and anxious, and Reagan stood tall, smiling, and asked, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" He won by a landslide. At 69, he became the oldest president elected at the time. But, was his presidency just beginning? Reagan's presidency opened with both hope and tension. He survived an assassination attempt just 69 days into his term, shot in the chest, but cracking jokes on the way to surgery. "Honey, I forgot to duck." He cut taxes dramatically with Reaganomics, believing in trickle-down economics and free markets. He slashed domestic spending even as defense budgets sowed inflation. Dropped, growth returned, but inequality widened. The wealthy grew wealthier. Critics called it a gilded age with cracks underneath. Still, he remained wildly popular to millions. He felt like America, optimistic, strong unapologetically, patriotic. Reagan hated communism, not just politically, but philosophically. He saw the Soviet Union as the evil empire, but he wasn't just bluster. He escalated the arms race, yes, but also began negotiations in 1987, standing before the Berlin Wall. He delivered one of history's most iconic lines. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 2 years later, the wall did fall. He developed an unexpected friendship with Mikhail Gorbachev, working together to sign landmark arms reduction treaties like INF, easing tensions and helping to end the Cold War. It was the cowboy and the communist shaking hands for the world to see. But not all was glitter. The Iran-Contra affair, in which the US secretly sold arms to Iran and used the money to fund rebels in Nicaragua, threatened to tarnish his legacy. Reagan claimed he hadn't been aware of the full scope. He was never directly implicated, but the scandal left a mark. Still, by the end of his second term, in 1989, Reagan left office with sky-high APR approval ratings. He had restored American confidence. He had won the Cold War. He had made people believe in the dream again. In 1994, Reagan wrote a letter to the American people announcing he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead. He lived out his final years with dignity and grace, cared for by Nancy Reagan, his fiercely devoted partner. He died on June 5th, 2004, at the age of 93,000 lined the streets to pay their respects. Flags flew at half-staff. The cowboy had ridden into the sunset. Ronald Reagan was a man of contradiction, a believer in small government who grew military spending, a cold warrior who ended the Cold War, an actor turned president who made the role seem made for him. To some, he was a savior of capitalism, to others, a symbol of neglect for the poor, but love him or critique him, he mattered. He reshaped American conservatism. He redefined through communication, and he left behind a country that once again believed in its own story. George H.W. Bush, the gentleman of the sea. George Herbert Walker Bush was born on June 12, 1924, in the lush coastal town of Milton, Massachusetts, into a family of privilege, but one where service and humility were ironclad expectations. His father, Prescott Bush, was a banker and U.S. senator, and his mother, Dorothy, was stern, but warm, instilling in young George a deep sense of duty, modesty, and a delightfully self-deprecating sense of humor. The Bush family wasn't loud, they didn't brag, they played tennis, went sailing, and believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. And from early on, George, nicknamed Poppy, shined with quiet courage and a relentless drive to make something of himself, not just for his name, but for his country. On his 18th birthday, just after graduating from the elite Phillips Academy in Andover, George enlisted in the U.S. Navy, becoming the youngest naval aviator. At the time, he flew torpedo bombers in the Pacific Theater. During World War II, in 1944, his plane was hit during a mission over the Bonin Islands. Despite the flames engulfing his aircraft, George completed the dropped his bombs and bailed out over the ocean. He was rescued by a U.S. submarine. Two of his crewmates did not survive. The experience never left him. Neither did the weight of responsibility. He returned home with the Distinguished Flying Cross and a sense that his life had been spared for a purpose. After the war, George married Barbara Pierce, his lifelong love, witty sparring partner, and the woman he always said made him laugh more than anyone else on earth. They would go on to have 6 children, including George W. Bush, a future president, and Jeb Bush, a future governor. In 1948, the young family moved to West Texas, where George entered the oil business. He wanted to build a life on his own terms, away from the East Coast establishment. He found success co-founding an oil company and becoming a millionaire. But money was never the goal he always had. One eye on public service, in 1966, he won a seat in Congress from Texas, and that was only the beginning. If experience were a currency, George H.W. Bush was one of the wealthiest men to ever hold office. Over the next 2 decades, he served as U.S. Representative Ambassador to the United Nations, Chairman of the Republican National Committee during Watergate, U.S. Envoy to China, Director of the CIA. Each role polished a different facet of his character. At the UN, he became a diplomat. In China, he biked through back streets to understand the people. At the CIA, he restored morale after years of scandal. He wasn't flashy, but he was competent, loyal, steady. In 1980, he ran for president, but lost the Republican nomination to Ronald Reagan, and then Reagan picked him as his running mate for 8 years. George H.W. Bush served as Reagan's vice president. a role he approached with trademark humility and loyalty. He defended Reagan during crisis. He traveled the world. He took on domestic and foreign missions. And behind the scenes, he built relationships with world leaders and Washington insiders alike. People joked about his awkward speeches, his Bushisms, but behind the gaps was a man of razor-sharp intellect and confidence. In 1988, he ran for president again, and this time he won. George H.W. Bush became the 41st President of the United States on January 20th, 1989, succeeding his friend and predecessor Ronald Reagan. At his inauguration, he called for a kinder, gentler nation. He promised to be a bridge between generations, between parties, and between America and the world. And then history knocked Bush's presidency was marked by global transformation. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. He managed the Cold War's peaceful end with incredible restraint and diplomacy. He built a coalition of 34 nations to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait in the Gulf War, a swift and successful mission praised for its international unity. At home, he signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, a landmark civil rights law. He supported clean air legislation and environmental protections. And despite pressure, he raised taxes, breaking his infamous "Read My Lips No New" taxes campaign promise because he believed it was fiscally necessary. It cost him politically, but he did it. Anyway, by 1992, the country was in a recession. Voters felt economic pain, and Bush's patrici manner, once seen as dignity, now felt distant to struggling Americans. A young saxophone-playing governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton captured the public's imagination. Bush lost re-election. He was heartbroken, quietly devastated, but as always, he showed grace. In a handwritten letter to Clinton on Inauguration Day, he wrote, "Your success now is our country's success. I am rooting hard for you." It was one of the classiest, most gracious moments in presidential history. After leaving office, George H.W. Bush never complained. He faded from the spotlight, focusing on charity work, family, and legacy. He famously skydived at age 90. He teamed up with former rival Bill Clinton to raise funds for disaster relief, showing the world what post-partisan decency looked like. He wrote letters, he wore quirky socks, he told dad jokes, he held Barbara's hand through every season. In 2018, after Barbara's death, George seemed to dim. He passed away on November 30th, 2018, at the age of 94. His funeral brought together presidents, political foes, and old friends, all united by their respect for a man who led with heart. George H.W. Bush's legacy is often overshadowed by the louder, flashier men who came before and after, but in the soft light of hindsight, he shines a war hero who never bragged. A president who chose principle over popularity, a man who believed in service before, during, and long after power. He didn't preach greatness, he practiced decency, and perhaps that is what history needs. Most of all, Bill Clinton, the charmer-in-chief. He was born William Jefferson BLL III on August 19th, 1946, in Hope, Arkansas, a fitting name for a boy who would spend his life chasing that very thing. His father, a traveling salesman, died in a car crash before Bill was even born. His mother, Virginia, remarried a car dealer named Roger Clinton, and young Bill eventually took his stepfather's last name, but home was not always happy. Roger was an alcoholic and abusive. Bill learned to mediate tension, to make peace, to charm his way through stormy dinners. It wasn't just survival, it was the training ground for a lifetime of diplomacy, persuasion, and performance. But make no mistake, Beneath the easy smile was an unbelievable mind. He was curious, a voracious reader, a budding policy nerd in a state where ambition often stayed small. He had the gift of words, the steel of ambition, and a sense that he was meant to do something enormous. Clinton's rise was a blend of genius and tenacity. He excelled in high school, played saxophone in the band, and even met President John F. Kennedy in the White House Rose Garden during a student trip to D.C. in 1963. A photo from that day shows Clinton beaming, and somewhere in that moment a seed was planted. He attended Georgetown University, then won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, where he studied philosophy and avoided the Vietnam draft in a decision that would shadow him for years. After Oxford came Yale Law School, where he met Hillary Rodham, a fierce, brilliant, no-nonsense woman with steel in her spine. He adored her mind. She adored his heart. They became partners in love and politics, and their relationship would go on to shape modernity. American history. After law school, the Clintons moved to Effville, Arkansas, where Bill taught law and began his political ascent. He lost his first race for Congress, but learned fast. In 1976, he was elected Attorney General of Arkansas. 2 years later, he became governor of Arkansas at just 32 years old. He was the youngest governor in America, but youth has its challenges. After one term, voters ousted him over unpopular taxes and mishandled policies. His response: he went back to work, listened more, talked less. And in 1982, he returned to the governor's mansion. Older, wiser, and ready. He served 10 years total as Arkansas governor, building a reputation for economic modernization, education reform, and of course, speeches that could bring a room to its feet. And then he set his eyes on Washington. In 1992, Clinton ran for president of the United States. The country was in a mild recession. President George H.W. Bush, fresh off a war. Victory seemed unbeatable until the economy soured and a charismatic young Southern Democrat entered the race. Clinton was relatable, brilliant, endlessly energetic. He talked about growing up in a place where people work hard and play by the rules. He played saxophone on late-night TV. He jogged. He loved fast food and policy papers in equal measure. And he survived scandal accusations of affairs, dodging the Vietnam draft, and more. He earned the nickname the Comeback Kid. He picked Al Gore, a fellow Southern moderate, as his running mate, and in November 1992, Bill Clinton defeated Bush, becoming the 42nd president at just 46 years old. Clinton's presidency began with a clear focus: the economy. He inherited a deficit and sluggish growth. His policies included raising taxes on the wealthy, expanding the earned income tax, credit reforming welfare, investing in technology, education, and job training. And shockingly to critics, it worked. The economy soared, unemployment fell, wages rose. The government ran budget surpluses by the late 1990s. The 1990s became an economic boom era, fueled by the tech explosion, globalization, and, yes, some very lucky timing. Clinton also signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which linked US Mexican and Canadian economies, a move loved by business and loathed by labor, and yet he kept winning. Clinton's foreign policy was a mix of restraint and engagement. He sent troops to Bosnia to stop genocide. He helped broker peace in Northern Ireland. He brought together Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat for the Oslo Accords. A major, if fragile, step toward Middle East peace. He struggled to define America's role in Rwanda, where genocide unfolded, and the US largely stood back. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton, the First Lady, defined the role entirely. She championed health care reform, chaired task forces, and faced enormous backlash for her visibility and influence. In 1994, her health care plan failed, but she remained one of the most prominent women in American politics and one of the most controversial. Bill Clinton was a gifted politician, but his personal flaws, particularly with women, never stopped following him. In 1998, news broke of an affair with Monica Lewinsky, a 22-year-old White House intern. Clinton denied it under oath. The evidence said otherwise. He was impeached by the House of Representatives for perjury and obstruction of justice, only the second president in history to face impeachment. The Senate acquitted him, and he stayed in office. His approval ratings sky high. The economy was booming, and many Americans saw the scandal as a personal matter. Still, the damage to his legacy was real and enduring. Hillary stood by him publicly, but their marriage was deeply tested in 2000. Clinton left office with the highest exit approval rating of any modern president. He went on to found the Clinton Foundation, promoting global health, economic development, and education. He gave speeches, wrote books, and remained a major political force. His wife Hillary was elected to the US Senate, then became Secretary of State, and the first woman nominated for president by a major party. The Clintons became a dynasty, admired, criticized, complex, and enduring. Bill Clinton's legacy is one of paradox, a progressive reformer who embraced centrist policies, a policy genius undone by personal weakness, a man who raised millions out of poverty but couldn't escape his own demons. He governed during peace and prosperity. He inspired millions. He frustrated many, but above all, he mattered. George W. Bush, the resolute rancher. George Walker Bush was born on July 6, 1946, in New Haven, Connecticut, but his soul was pure Texas. He was the first child of George H.W. Bush and Barbara Pierce Bush, a future president and first lady. The Bush family name was already heavy with expectations, but Little Dubia, as they pronounced it in Texas, was more mischief than majesty. He grew up in Midland and Houston, chasing baseballs, skipping stones, and mimicking accent. His younger brother, Jeb, was the more serious student. George Jr. was charming, funny, and loved making people laugh. But he struggled academically, and he carried grief in 1953 when George was just 7. His younger sister, Robin, died of leukemia. Her absence haunted the Bush family. It made little George grow up fast and then rebel even faster. George W. Bush went to Yale University like his father, but he didn't shine there. He was a gentleman's SE student, a frat boy who partied hard, told great stories, and coasted on charisma. Later, he earned a Harvard MBA, making him the only president in US history with that degree, but in between those miles, stones were what he later called his young and irresponsible years. He drank too much, drifted from job to job, oil, baseball, politics. He was restless, funny, likable, but not focused. Then in 1977, he met Laura Welch, a quiet, thoughtful librarian. She was everything he wasn't: introverted, measured, gentle. They married 3 months after their first date, and slowly George changed. In 1986, after years of soul-searching and one particularly dusty morning jog, he gave up alcohol completely, became a born-again Christian, began reading the Bible deeply, and found the faith that would shape the rest of his life. He was no longer just the son of a president. He was preparing to become his own man. In 1994, George W. Bush ran for governor of Texas against the incumbent, and Richards, a sharp-witted Democrat with a national profile. No one thought he'd win. But he ran a smart, positive, focused campaign, and he won as governor. He was pragmatic. He reached across the A. He pushed education, reform, cut taxes, and emphasized personal responsibility. He made allies of Democrats. He didn't pick fights. He got things done. And soon Republicans began to see something else. He wasn't just a Bush. He was a candidate. In 2008, George W. Bush ran for president, promising to bring compassionate conservatism to Washington, a mix of traditional values and softer social policy. He ran against Al Gore, vice president under Clinton. It was one of the closest and most controversial elections in U.S. history. The fate of the presidency came down to Florida, where the margin was Ra's, a thin after recounts, lawsuits, and ballot drama. Remember those hanging? Chad's the Supreme Court ruled to halt the recount. Bush won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. And so he entered the White House under a cloud of uncertainty. He planned to focus on education, tax cuts, and restoring civility. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, George W. Bush was reading to school children in Florida when the world changed. Terrorists hijacked 4 planes. 2 struck the World Trade Center, 1 hit the Pentagon, another crashed in Pennsylvania. After passengers fought back, almost 3,000 lives were lost. The nation grieved, the world wept, and George W. Bush found his voice standing atop rubble at ground zero with a megaphone in hand. He shouted to rescue workers, "I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you." It was the beginning of a presidency defined by war, resilience, and hard decisions. In the wake of September 11, Bush launched the war on terror. He created the Department of Homeland Security, signed the Patriot Act, expanded surveillance to detect terrorism, led the invasion of Afghanistan, targeting Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. Then, in 2003, came the most controversial move of his presidency, the invasion of Iraq, believing Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Bush declared war. Saddam was overthrown, but the weapons were never found. A long, bloody insurgency followed. Thousands of American and Iraqi lives were lost. Critics called it a war of choice. Supporters called it a necessary stand. Bush's popularity soared, then plummeted, but through it all he remained firm, unshaken, in his belief that freedom was worth fighting for. In 2004, Bush defeated John Kerry to win re-election. He leaned heavily on national security and strong leadership, but his second term was turbulent. Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. The federal response was slow, chaotic, and heavily criticized. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan dragged on. The financial crisis of 2008 hit in the final months of his presidency, shaking the economy to its core. Despite efforts to stem the collapse with emergency bailouts, Bush left office deeply unpopular, but once again he handled it. With grace, he welcomed Barack Obama to the White House, warmly, privately advising him, publicly supporting the peaceful transition. After leaving office, George W. Bush vanished from the political stage. For a while he returned to Texas, picked up a paintbrush and began painting veterans, world leaders, and even himself. He published books, opened the Bush Presidential Center, focused on wounded warriors. And slowly the country saw another side of him, funny, gracious, honest, self-deprecating. He avoided criticizing successes until January 6th, 2021, when he broke his silence to condemn the Capitol insurrection as un-American. He had become a kind of elder statesman, flawed but wise, a man who had lived through the fire and come out quieter and perhaps even softer. On the other side, George W. Bush remains one of the most polarizing figures in modern American history. To some, he was a president who defended the nation after its darkest hour. To others, he was the man who led the country into endless wars. But to all, he was human, imperfect, resilient, and perhaps more complex than anyone gave him credit for Barack Obama, the hopeful horizon. Barack Hussein Obama II was born on August 4, 1961, in Honolulu, Hawaii, a place kissed by sun, sea, and the strange poetry of identity. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was a Kenyan economist and scholarship student. His mother, Ann Dunham, was a curious, open-hearted woman from Kansas with a love of anthropology, an adventure. They met in college, they fell in love, and they fell apart. Barack Sr. returned to Kenya when Barack Jr. was just 2. He saw his son only once again. Ann later married an Indonesian man, and young Barack moved to Jakarta. There he witnessed both poverty and resilience, chickens on dirt roads, candlelit homework, a world far from American suburbia. Eventually he returned to Hawaii to live with his grandparents, Gramps and Toot, who raised him with a mix of Scotch sarcasm and deep love. From the start, Barack belonged everywhere and nowhere. Black and white, Midwestern, an islander, rooted in America, but with a name that rhymed with nothing on the playground, and somehow that would become his superpower. Obama wasn't a perfect student, but he was curious, a voracious reader. He devoured books, the way some kids devour video games. He went to Accidental College in California, then transferred to Columbia University in New York City. He studied political science, walked the streets with headphones, wondered what his life should mean. After graduation, he became a community organizer in the South Side of Chicago, working with churches to uplift neighborhoods struggling with joblessness, crime, and despair. Obama would later say it was the best education he ever received. He went on to Harvard Law School, where he became the first black president of the Harvard Law Review. And with every speech, every step, every hour of study, he was rising in Chicago. He met Michelle Robinson, a fellow lawyer, tall, brilliant, and absolutely not interested in dating an intern, but he persisted, and eventually she melted. They married in 1992 in a ceremony full of laughter music and soul food. She grounded him. He lifted her together. They raised 2 daughters, Malia and Sasha, and built a life that blended passion and purpose. Obama taught constitutional law, wrote books, helped register thousands of new voters, and in 1996 he ran for Illinois State Senate. He won. Politics had come calling, and this time he was ready. In 2004, Obama ran for the US Senate, but it wasn't the campaign that made him famous. It was the speech at the Democratic National Convention. He delivered the keynote address, speaking not as a star, but as a son, a father, a believer in the American idea. There's not a liberal America and a conservative America. There's the United States of America. The crowd roared. The nation leaned in. He won the Senate seat in a landslide. And suddenly everyone asked the same question. Could he be president? In 2008, Barack Obama ran for president. He faced the political juggernaut of Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary, and won. He chose Joe Biden as his running mate. And then he faced John McCain, a respected war hero and senator, the backdrop. A nation weary from war, battered by a financial crisis, and longing for change. Obama ran on hope, on UN, on the belief that America could begin again, and on November 4th, 2008, the unthinkable became reality. Barack Obama was elected the 44th President of the United States, the first black president. People wept in the streets. Hearts swelled history, cracked wide open. He took office in 2009, facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Banks were failing, jobs were disappearing. Hope was hard to hold. Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, pumping nearly $800 billion into the economy. He bailed out the auto industry, stabilized banks, pushed for regulation. And then he did something presidents had failed to do for decades. He passed health care reform, the Affordable Care Act, nicknamed Obamacare, expanded coverage to millions of Americans. It was divisive, messy, imperfect, and historic. He also ended the war in Iraq, ordered the operation that killed Osama bin Laden, appointed Sonia Soto and Elena Kagan to the Supreme Court, advocated for LGBT plus rights, helping overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and endorsing same-sex marriage. He governed with caution and intellect, sometimes too cautious, critics said, but always deliberate, and in 2012 he was re-elected, defeating Mitt Romney. Obama's presidency was not without pain. The rise of racist conspiracy theories, questioning his birthplace, the Charleston church, shooting and rising gun violence, the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting, where 20 children died and gun laws still didn't change, the Tea Party movement which slammed him from the right, the emergence of deep partisan divides. And yet he remained calm. His greatest weapon wasn't just policy, it was language. His speeches could move nations, heal wounds, stir souls when he sang Amazing Grace at the funeral of Reverend Clementa Pinckney in Charleston. The room shook. He was a president of words, and sometimes words were everything. In 2016, after 2 terms, Barack Obama handed the presidency to Donald Trump, a man who had built a campaign partly on undermining Obama's legacy. Still, Obama welcomed him with grace. He and M left the White House with class and dignity, disappearing from politics for a time, but they didn't disappear. From life, Obama wrote A Promised Land, a memoir as eloquent and introspective as the man himself. He created the Obama Foundation, focused on leadership, civic engagement, and the next generation. And Michelle, oh Michelle, became one of the most beloved first ladies in history, inspiring millions with her own voice books and activism. Barack Obama was not perfect. He struggled with immigration reform. He used drone strikes in warfare that drew criticism. He faced gridlock obstruction and polarization. But he also restored dignity to the office, inspired millions of young people, especially people of color, modeled empathy, intelligence, and restraint, proved that change is possible, even if slow. He wasn't just the first black president, he was a symbol that the dream still breathes.